series, graduate speaker series within the MNC Colloquium. So the audience for today is a mixture of the Colloquium students and all others in Klein community who've come to join us in this third talk as part of the fall graduate program. Dean for Research and Graduate Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Andrea Wenzel, who is Assistant Professor in the Department of Journalism at Temple University. And she has a new book, Community-Centered Journalism, published by University of Illinois Press. A little bit about today's lecture, which is based on the book. In this moment of current moment of pandemic protests and elections, access to local news is critical for both civic and physical health. But for many historically marginalized communities, local news is either distrusted, in short supply, or both. In this talk, Dr. Wenzel will discuss her book, Community-Centered Journalism, Engaging People, Exploring Solutions, and Building Trust. In it, she draws from engaged journalism and solutions journalism case studies from around the U.S. to outline a model for building trust and between communities and local media. A little bit more about Assistant Professor Wenzel of the Department of Journalism. She is a fellow with Columbia University's Tow Center for Digital Journalism and the co-founder of the Germantown InfoHub. Prior to completing her PhD at USC Annenberg, she spent 15 years as a radio producer at WBEZ and WAMU, and a trainer and project manager for organizations such as BBC Media Action and Internews in Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Iraq, and Ghana. Please welcome Dr. Wenzel.
Thank you. It's so nice to see everyone. Thank you so much for letting me join you today. And I have to give a little warning that I have a co-presenter here, just off camera at the moment, who may make her presence known from time to time. In fact, I should have shown her because now she wants to be on the screen. So if you hear me muting or making faces and weird noises, that's probably why. But I'll try to go ahead and dig into the presentation before I lose my opportunity here, which I may already have. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Just one second. Let's see. Can everybody see my screen okay? Just holler if you cannot, or hopefully you see just the screen, not the notes and all that. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So yeah, thanks so much for all of you. Some of you on the call who helped me out in various points along the way in the book, so that it's great to see you. I wanted just to kind of start off with what the limitations of what this book is not trying to do, and that is it's not trying to save the journalism industry. It's not really about saving the industry per se. It is a book about trying to reimagine how journalism could better serve communities, and what that looks like could bear little resemblance to more traditional ideas of journalism. Along the way, I am hopeful that the process of community-centered journalism could help to repair journalism and to address some of the harms that journalism has caused over the years, including the problem of trust. But my starting point is not how to improve the journalism industry, it's how to improve the communication health of communities. So, as Patrick mentioned, so why did I write this book? I used to work in public radio and international media development. And when I did, I would experiment with things that now I might call solutions journalism. So we started out a weekly series where we asked people to nominate organizations or people who are doing something to try to improve a problem in the world. And we found that was our most popular programs. And I also experimented with that in other countries where I worked with journalists in Sri Lanka during the Civil War, where they would ask people, what's the problem you're trying to solve in your community? And they would go with them as they tried to report about what they were doing to try to solve it. So this caught my interest and piqued my interest in this concept of solutions journalism before I had words to describe it. Likewise, when I was in Afghanistan, I got to see examples of using community-based research to inform programming. So when I came back to the US, I tried to adapt some of these processes of solutions journalism and community engagement and research to inform discussions that we did on radio programs. But I didn't have the time doing, a regular program to really think about, how is this working and how could it work better, let alone what to call it. So when I went back to school for my PhD, I found that a lot of these concepts did have names. There were some traditions like peace journalism and public journalism. And here's where I have to pick up the baby. Sorry. So this is Ruby. She has a lot of opinions. So hopefully she'll kind of hang out here. So when I went back for my PhD, I discovered that there were concepts like peace journalism and solutions journalism. And there's a new group at the time, it was brand new, called the Solutions Journalism Network. And they put forward this concept of solutions journalism, which basically holds that it's the journalist's role, not just to report on the problems, but also to report on responses to problems. And you can check out their website for more information and examples of solutions journalism stories. And it also kind of points out that it's not the same thing as just doing good news stories or puff pieces. A bit later on, I started hearing the term engaged journalism. And this is something that's a little trickier to pin down because people use the word engagement to mean a million different things. And basically, I find this definition from Lindsay Green Barber to be helpful. Basically, it's a range of practices that try to build relationships between journalists and the public, to involve the public in the journalistic process in some way. So engaged journalism practices can take many forms, from initiatives focused on listening to communities to get their story ideas, to working with community members to produce and distribute content. And if you're interested in more about this engaged journalism concept in particular, you might want to check out the website Gather for some more resources. So I wanted to understand what happens when you combine solutions journalism and engaged journalism. So I think of these things as sort of the peanut butter and jelly of the journalism world. So you could have each of them by their own, they're pretty tasty, but when they're combined together, aren't they just so much better? So that's what I sort of wanted to experiment with and understand. And so I wanted to also think about this not just in an abstract way, but in the context of places. So what would it look like for journalists to try to build trust with communities by combining engaged journalism and solutions journalism? So I'm not going to get too into the details with this theory, but I draw on communication infrastructure theory because it's a theory that can assess the communication health of communities and then be used to design interventions and evaluate them. Basically, it argues that every community has different actors who are involved in telling a community's story. So you have local media, but you also have residents and you have community organizations. And researchers have found that in communities where these connections are stronger between these groups, they tend to have higher levels of civic participation and a sense of belonging. And I wanted to understand whether introducing solutions journalism and engaged journalism could affect the storytelling network. And often in some cases, there's damage to the storytelling network because there's a lack of trust. There's a sense that all the stories are negative. And so I was particularly interested in looking at communities that had a history of being marginalized by news media by having coverage that's almost always negative. So one of the book's big questions is this: can interventions that use solutions journalism and engaged journalism build trust and strengthen communication in communities? So throughout this book, I look at a series of case studies from different parts of the US that look at different parts of the local storytelling network. So I start out in South LA, a majority Black and Latinx community that historically has been stigmatized by news media. And I worked with colleagues there to hold workshops to try to connect community organizations with local journalists. And these led to a series of solutions journalism stories that we then circled back with residents to get their opinions on. And they were enthusiastic about the concept of solutions journalism, but they had concerns about who gets to tell these stories, and they wanted communities to be more involved in the process. So this intervention did do some work to strengthen ties between community groups and local media, and solutions journalism was promising in that it contributed to more positive narratives circulating about South LA. But without the engagement component, residents didn't really find out about the communities or the efforts that were behind those stories. Sorry, they didn't find out about the stories or the efforts behind them. So after that case, I looked at another one in Chicago where a newsroom was trying to involve community members in the process of storytelling more. Some of you might have heard of a thing called Hearken. It's a tool that lets newsrooms invite audiences to ask questions and then vote on what stories they want reporters to report on. So a lot of different newsrooms use this tool now. Curious City is their first project, and they have a process where they have reporters go out and work with the community member to report on the question that they asked. But a few years back, they looked at where the questions they got were coming from, and they noticed they weren't hearing very much from predominantly African American and Latinx neighborhoods on the south and west sides. And so they wanted to expand who they got questions from, and so they designed an outreach experiment. So I shadowed them as they tried a few different approaches in this experiment. They asked people face to face, just asked them for questions. That got good results, but it was not very efficient. It was also hard to explain to people, like, why do you want questions? They also worked with partner organizations and would do things like leave a question box. That didn't have much success. People didn't really pay attention to the boxes. And they did a Facebook marketing campaign, which bought targeted ads that reached about 200,000 people, but they only got 14 questions. So that, because that also had a significant cost, was not effective at all. The most effective method was when they did a combination of face-to-face outreach with collaborating with partners, and especially when they worked with libraries. This gave people an opportunity to interact with people directly, but in a space that was familiar to them, and was trusted. They had the trust of the libraries. But even this effort had limitations because they didn't really market it, and so they didn't close the loop back around to community members after they did the stories, and so people didn't really know how to continue to be connected or to have any feedback on the stories. So in this case, the intervention did strengthen the link between media and residents, but it wasn't a two-way relationship, and the project didn't do much to engage community organizations because they were skeptical about them having an agenda, so it was just sort of a limited intervention. But after observing these projects, I wanted to think about what a model might be for giving communities more power to be involved in the process. I'm just going to hide my video for a second so I can try to do something here. So I wanted to try to see what a model might look like for giving communities more power to be involved in making and sharing narratives about their community and making these more solutions-oriented stories. And so I teamed up with someone named Sam Ford, who's a consultant based in Western Kentucky, and we tested a model for a research-based local journalism intervention. We focused on a majority white, majority Republican area in Western Kentucky, and we looked at how political polarization affected local storytelling networks there. We did a series of focus groups, story diaries, and interviews. And the short version of what we found is that political polarization did affect how people connected to community groups and each other, but when it came to local news, there were outlets people from across the political spectrum shared. So we also learned that regardless of politics, people felt outsiders stigmatized the region and their coverage. So we shared our findings at a workshop with residents, community leaders, and local journalists, and groups working in engaged journalism and solutions journalism. And we got their input on what we could do to follow up. And so one of the projects that grew out of this was with this journalism organization called Ohio County Monitor. And this is the Ohio County Monitor. Dustin and Lee Bratcher are the entirety of this organization. They're the owners, the editors, reporters, and photographers. And several of the ideas that came from this project, sorry, Several of the ideas that came from the project, having a bit of a meltdown. A number of them are trying to reimagine community traditions. So things in the community that were already there, but looking at how they could be kind of updated. And so one of those is a pre-Facebook tradition called society colonists. And so, you know, back in the day, people would, you know, it'd be a way of talking about, you know, so-and-so had a baby, so-and-so had a guest from out of town, but also things like so-and-so is sick and could use some help. And so the OC Monitor said, okay, let's reimagine this and have community contributors. And that way we can cover distant parts of the county that we're not able to get to otherwise. The other tradition that they looked at was something called liars tables. So, and this is not my word for it. This is what they call themselves. And in this part of Kentucky, if you go into a convenience store in the morning, you might find a group of men having coffee, and this, they would say, solving the world's problems. So these are mostly farmers, coal miners, and retirees, and it's how they find out what's happening in the area. And so Dustin and Lee wanted to think about how the OC Monitor could connect with these groups and connect these groups to their readers. So we documented their piloting of these different small projects, and then we tried to connect them with potential resources to take next steps. So we followed through this work, we followed a community-centered process where we did a study of people's needs and assets and then brought them together to design a project that responded to these and piloted and monitored that project. So this, you know, I have to be very clear, this is not a scalable project. So it would never make sense to do liars tables tours in Philadelphia. But I wanted to know if the process could be followed in different places. So that's what I worked on with colleagues in 2 different areas of the Philly area. As many of you know, Germantown is a majority African-American neighborhood, and then Montgomery County, a majority white suburb. And we did a study with residents in both places, looking at their relationship with local news and their needs and assets, following a similar methodology. And there was a sense in Germantown that coverage was disproportionately negative and focused on crime. Whereas in Montgomery County, participants talked more about an absence of local news. So we held workshops to discuss research findings and recommendations in Montgomery County and in Germantown. And I'll focus briefly on what grew out of the discussions in Germantown in particular. So there, community members shared ideas that led to the creation of the Germantown InfoHub project, and it tackles these 2 main goals. So trying to improve the circulation of information within communities about hyperlocal issues, resources and events that might not be relevant to citywide or regional audiences. So things that wouldn't necessarily make sense for the Inquirer to cover, but are really important if you have a family in Germantown. And the second goal is trying to strengthen the relationship between communities and the media. So trying to improve how communities are represented, what kind of narratives are told. So it does this by working with an advisory group of community members, a staff with a community organizer and a community reporter. And then there's occasionally classes where students and community members co-report stories. I think there's some people from our first class on this call, and media partners and researchers. So myself and Latrell Crittenden at Jefferson University. So before COVID, face-to-face outreach was a core activity of the project. And we invite community members to tell us issues that they want a journalist to cover and report on. We also send out weekly announcements with local events and stories. We're just in the process of switching over to a different platform. So this is not, don't text to that number because it won't work. And then this is our website, which has a mix of community news, solutions-oriented stories, profiles, events, and resources. So one of the most successful elements of the project has been doing monthly community discussions. So these are often about issues that residents nominate. So it could be anything from gun violence to trash to redevelopment concerns. Or we have accountability conversations where we invite local journalists to come out and just talk about a story they've done about the neighborhood so that they can get feedback and try to establish relationships with community members that they might not meet otherwise. So this project is ongoing, and I continue to work with colleagues to monitor it and follow up. It's had some success so far, but the argument is not to clone a bunch of Germantown InfoHub projects, even from one neighborhood of Philadelphia to another. It wouldn't make sense. So there's different needs and assets in every community. And that in this process of doing community-centered project design, that's sort of a key thing. But transposing this process model from Kentucky to Philly shows that there is a process that is portable. And just breaking down what that process is. So, assessing the community's information needs and assets, trying to account for power and place dynamics as that's done, sharing results in a convening, so some sort of workshop to gather together study participants, community stakeholders, local journalists, and trying to work with them collaboratively to brainstorm pilot interventions. And circling back with community stakeholders and journalists to try to develop and launch pilot interventions, and then monitor and evaluate those interventions. So just going back to that communication infrastructure theory concept, these cases show how the local storytelling network can be weakened when there's a lack of trust, and how this can be caused by things like polarization or overly negative representation of communities, or when objectivity norms prevent journalists from building relationships with community stakeholders. And so the hope is, at least in some ways, that community-based interventions that draw from both engaged journalism and solutions journalism practices can counter some of these barriers and start to build trust. And when I tried to wrap up this book, I put the cases that I've just been exploring into the context of the larger fields of engaged journalism and solutions journalism by talking to different leaders of different initiatives, so the ones that are on the screen here. And I argue that for engaged journalism and solutions journalism initiatives to strengthen ties between local storytelling networks, new roles and skills are needed from journalists. Most of these projects challenge traditional journalism norms and assumptions in some way. So they use skills like facilitation or community organizing practices. And I think these projects illustrate some of the different paths to doing journalism that are community-centered. And I think also some things that I'd like to see journalism schools consider teaching more, some different kinds of practices. Sorry. And then finally, based on the cases I explore in this book, I try and conclude with some recommendations for practitioners. So I recommend looking for opportunities to combine engaged journalism and solutions journalism, letting go of the expectation that everything has to always be on the newsroom's terms. So trying to share power and find ways for more equitable interactions to take place. Building relationships with different kinds of community stakeholders, including organizations. Trying to establish feedback and accountability loops. And then questioning norms of detached objectivity that historically have privileged whiteness and authority. And then also for funders, I encourage them to consider community-led grant making and the funding process the funding of processes, not only projects. And just, I kind of was going through this and realizing I never really defined community-centered journalism very, very overtly. So I just took a stab at just thinking that through. That basically it's journalism that's produced for and with communities, and that centers both community needs and assets. And that it has the goal of improving the communication health of communities by using strategies and practices that are responding to those needs and assets. So, of course, I wrote all this pre-pandemic, and many of the community-centered journalism initiatives I wrote about had face-to-face interaction at their core. So what does this work look like now? A number of these initiatives are trying to find ways to adapt this framework. So for our Germantown InfoHub project, we did a series of Zoom focus groups to assess the information needs, and then based on that, one of the suggestions was to have a town hall, a Zoom town hall, to connect community groups with each other to talk about their COVID responses. And so, our outreach tactics have changed. If we want to do a one-on-one meeting or use community organizing strategies, it's, we have to do online or by phone, but we still try to use the same principles. Just we have to connect with people in a different way and think about, who has limited internet access. So as long as the needs and assets of communities are centered, I think that these things can be adapted. So thank you very much. Sorry, it's been a little bit of a noisy adventure here. My daughter woke up an hour earlier than normal today, and so I was hoping she would not be in nap meltdown mode already, but she is. So thanks for your patience with that. And also, if anybody's interested in getting the book, I have a promo code that you're welcome to use. And I wish I could just share them with you, but they never even sent me a digital copy. So that's probably the best I can offer. So thank you so much. I look forward to, answering any questions and talking more with you.
Thank you very much. Let's open it up for questions. We have, I think, a couple already in the chat, so maybe start off with one of those.
Here, let me stop sharing the screen.
Hal Conte asked, should news media employees reach out through Facebook to community groups, libraries? Our local paper does community reader polls, but it's mostly the subscribers that are non-representative. How can we avoid seeming like we're lecturing residents?
It's a great question. I mean, I think there's a huge difference between thinking about audience and thinking about community. So, I would encourage like any news outlet to do even the most basic information needs assessment by, thinking about like who are some of the key, what are the key resources? So maybe it's a Facebook group, a neighborhood Facebook group. Maybe it's a community organization that has it's a Facebook group or has like a listserv, like think kind of mapping out like who you could collaborate with to reach. And that way you can, if you're doing a poll or you're doing some sort of survey or engagement, you could get them to help you distribute it so that you're able to get beyond just sort of the pre-existing subscribers that you already have.
Thank you. Do we have, you can raise your hands on the screen. I'll try and locate you.
There's another question in the chat.
Sorry, I'm having a hard time scrolling and
I'm
holding
not sure
her. So pardon me for 1 second while I try to put the baby in the carrier. I'm still here and I can hear you and I can try to talk, but I will disappear for a second.
Fab, I can't find it. You want to go ahead and read it?
Okay. How are you funded and where do you see the model going?
How am I funded? So like, how is the Germantown InfoHub project funded, maybe? I mean, I'm personally, I've gotten research funding from the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University for a lot of these research projects, but the journalism initiatives have gotten funding from different places. So pretty much everything has been philanthropically funded. Nothing is, there's no business model here. It's all funding from like local Philly journalism funders, and Philly is very unusual in having so many philanthropic funders focused on media, which is not a luxury that most cities have. So there's LenFest here, there's IPMF, there's a number of different funders here. Unfortunately, I really think that, philanthropic funding is not the answer to making journalism sustainable. It's sort of what we have right now. I don't think business, advertisements are not going to cover these things. I think we ultimately need to be thinking about publicly funded media, but that's, obviously a longer conversation. So yeah, I think in the short term, philanthropic funding is important. There are people experimenting with different membership models, experiments in different kinds of communities, which are interesting, but I don't know that those are going to be enough. So.
Thank you. Another question from the audience?
There's, again, another one in the chat.
Professor Mindig, I think, let's go with the, and then we'll get to the chat in a second.
Okay.
When do you anticipate, oh, sorry, go ahead.
So to what extent do you see a connection between, like, in the 90s, Jay Rosen's citizen journalism, public journalism, like a line between what, and I know that those terms were kind of slippery, and Jay Rosen got a lot of criticism for kind of the slipperiness of those terms, public journalism and citizen journalism. But to what extent do you see like a line between those initiatives in the 90s and what you're doing today?
I think there's definitely a line between those. I think public journalism, civic journalism have kind of, I think what we now call engaged journalism has adapted a lot of the same concepts. I think there's, probably some different, and there's certainly like digital affordances that we have now that we didn't have then. There's a lot of things that make it easier to reach people and to interact with people. But there's also, I think, some elements of some of the most recent engaged journalism efforts that I'm not sure were being done as much them. So it's like, I think the focus on community organizing strategies, I don't know how, I mean, I think some of that was being done in the public journalism, civic journalism efforts, but I think some folks now are being really savvy about thinking about that and thinking about how power is shared. That goes even, I think, beyond some of those efforts in terms of really trying to decenter the newsroom and thinking about how you center communities. But yeah, I think there's definitely a line between the two, and there's a lot of resonance between those two.
Yeah, just really quickly, that when I think of like the way that in the 90s they constituted communities, they kind of had these open forums, but they were run by the journalists. So it sounds like what you're doing is really trying to decenter the conversation, so you're no longer like the moderator, the sole moderator, and every voice kind of goes through you.
Yeah, I think there's a spectrum of this, right? So I think that there's really great things that newsrooms themselves are doing where they are still kind of the center, but they're trying to use some of these strategies, and I think that's still good. I think it's a both and. I think that it's important to also try to do these projects that are kind of pushing things out more and are not necessarily started by journalists, that are started in collaboration. It's collaborations between communities and journalists. So, yeah, thank you. Professor Fink,
We have a question from Karen Gallagher. When do you anticipate being able to share the process model from the Germantown InfoHub?
I mean, it's in the book. So it's basically, I mean, when I say the process model, it's basically what I kind of went through in terms of, that process of doing an information needs assessment with community, circling, so you do your initial research study, you circle back with the community members to sort of try to co-design intervention, piloting and testing that intervention, and then adjusting as necessary based on that. So it's sort of just it's a process for working with communities to design the project. And I'm happy to to talk more in addition, but it is like kind of written up in the book chapter, and there's also some I can share some web links to things that have been in Columbia Journalism Review that might be helpful in that regard too.
Another question from Professor Kantrowitz. What have some newsrooms journalists done to successfully advertise their community outreach opportunities?
Interesting question. I mean, to advertise their opportunities, I guess, I mean, in some ways the opportunities themselves are advertising, I don't know that they're like doing advertising in the traditional sense as much as trying to do kind of grassroots outreach. So, working, one thing that I think historically journalists have been a bit allergic to working with community organizations. And that's something that I think for this sort of work is really important to get over that, because some of the most successful things I've seen have been when projects work collaboratively with community organizations to help reach populations that they're otherwise not going to reach. that again is kind of being beyond your audience to reaching communities. But I mean, I'm sure there are like interesting, more traditional advertising approaches that just are escaping me at the moment. But I think a lot of times it tends to be more grassroots. I'm not sure if I answered that, but sorry.
Thank you. Professor Fink.
Hi. I have a question that I think probably every one of us could attempt an answer, but I'd like to hear your answer because I think that would be better than, at least better than mine. And that is on one of the PowerPoint slides you made, it was shown quickly, but it was in a connection between objectivity and benefiting whites, or something to that effect. I don't have the wording just exactly right. Could you tell us, please, the process by which those two things are associated? What's going on here?
Sure, and there definitely are people on this call who've probably been thinking about this for longer than I have and have good answers. But I mean, basically, you know, there's an argument that traditionally the way objectivity gets interpreted, and there's definitely arguments that objectivity gets interpreted incorrectly or in different ways, but the practices of sourcing so-called authority figures and people who will, you know, only named sources, things like that, tends to favor people in positions of power, tends to primarily end up overrepresenting white and male voices. And so there's an argument that kind of rethinking that is really important because, you know, people are very skeptical of journalists when they, you know, try to cultivate relationships with community groups or community organizers, but it's more accepted to cultivate relationships with people in positions of power, to, you know, to have them as sources. So it's sort of trying to question that these habits, how they've been practiced traditionally, have tended to have the result of reinforcing white supremacy by amplifying white voices, and so that it's important to kind of rethink that. I'm sure the, you know, sleep deprived answer there, but and I'm sure others can speak more to that. But.
Thank you. We have another one here in the chat from Michelle Shaner, which is there's an organization called Report for America and another called Solutions Journalism. It seems that some of your work overlaps with both. Are you working with these organizations to get the word out and collaborate?
Yeah, I actually did a study about Report for America a year or so ago. If you Google Report for America, Columbia Journalism Review, and my name, it will come up. Or I could, again, I would share these in the chat, but my hands are somewhat occupied. So yeah, I mean, I'm very familiar with Report for America and Solutions Journalism Network, and have, you know, been in touch with them for various things. The Report for America, we did a research study on how 2 communities were kind of responding to their efforts in a community in Eastern Kentucky in Appalachia and a community in the west side of Chicago. And it was, you know, our findings were that they needed to do more work on engagement, that they have a very interesting model that has a lot of promise, but that at that time with those particular communities, people were not aware of their work, and they kind of had a sense that the reporting was more about their community than for their community. And Report for America was great at, you know, taking our feedback and you know, responding to it and trying to think about how they could potentially adapt some things. So I'm hopeful that they do, and I'm hopeful that they continue to grow. I mean, like, strengthen their internal practices in that regard, because I do think they do they have a lot of, they're very growing project that has a lot of potential. Solutions Journalism Network is great, and I've you know, collaborated with them. I interviewed them for this book, and you know, they continue to grow and do really interesting work. So definitely check out their website if you're interested in solutions journalism. So.
Other questions?
Hi, how you doing? You touched on this a little bit in an earlier question, but you mentioned the idea of communication health, and I'm just sort of wondering what you think, you know, the effect of, disproportionate negative news coverage, what do you think that has, what type of impact do you think that has on the individuals within the communities themselves? You talked about Germantown. Just how do you think that affects the citizens within the community when, all they're seeing is the crime being covered or,
I think it has a hugely negative effect on people, and people have told me that they actually feel physically stressed, and people either avoid the news, or if they do consume it, it's taking a negative toll on their sense of self, and their also it takes a negative toll on the community in terms of how people feel about visiting that community, investing in that community. That's another thing that people tell us, is that they're people won't come to my neighborhood because they hear that it's dangerous, and so it takes a very negative toll on people, at least in the communities that I've spoken with folks. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a serious thing. It contributes to a lot of, I mean, we're all very well aware of this news avoidance phenomena that I think a lot of people, even myself, have ended up avoiding news because of just feeling overwhelmed by it. But if you live in a community that's the only thing you see is negative news coverage, it just amplifies that problem.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Comment here in the chat, solutions are from Asabi, which is solutions journalism proved to be a great marriage with the Communication Development for Change program, as the working model changed from the top-down approach to community development change to from the top-down approach to an attitude to inclusion and actuating what the community sees as relevant and important. Thank you for that comment. Yeah, there are some kind of really interesting overlaps here, I think, with some of the literature on communication development and social change. And so sort of drawing from Asabi's comment, do you see or have you drawn on that literature or some of those case studies, particularly since you also worked with BBC Media Action, which I know is very much grounded in that kind of theoretical orientation, research orientation?
Yeah, I mean, definitely that's one of the reasons why I went back to academia, was my experience with BBC Media Action. And it strangely turned out that the project I was working on, the researchers who had been involved in it before I got there, long before I got there, had actually worked with my advisor in graduate school. So Sandra Ball-Rokich had mentored them. And so it was a strange connecting of the dots there, that the literature I draw on a lot is connected to that, and it's a communication literature that's not necessarily solidly in the journalism camp or in the communication for development camp, but that has ties to both. But I want to explore that more. I'm actually working on a project now where I'm hoping to look more at some international media development projects that focus on conflict resolution and attempts to bridge between difference, because I think that's a topic that obviously in this country right now we need to discuss. And so I'm hoping to kind of dip back into that literature some more. I've never really had the time to go into it as much depth as I've wanted to. So I'm looking forward to that. Because I think there's a lot of resonance, and I find I've organized some what we've been calling engaged journalism exchange conversations, where we connect practitioners and researchers. And in times when I brought people from like Internews or from that world to talk about their experiences doing this work in other countries and different contexts, those have been some of the most interesting, because the journalists here were like, oh, we didn't realize that this was a thing. You've been doing this work for decades, on like health communication or different contexts that are really relevant, but we don't often those worlds, they're going to different conferences, they're going to it's just not, they're not connecting. And so I think that it's important to kind of look at how we can connect those more.
Yeah, and of course the communication development and social change field also has drawn quite a bit from case examples where many of those communities or those audiences are not literate. And so then you have to talk about different ways in which ideas and information are communicated. And that sort of, in a way, takes us back to your liar's table, right? That sort of organic conversational exchange of information and ideas, which is really sort of an interesting connection there. So we do have a little bit more time. Lauren, yes, Professor Krogan.
Hi, thanks. This is such a great presentation. Thank you, Andrea. I wanted to sort of loop back around some of the things that you've been saying. I know you said at the beginning of the presentation, you wanted to make it really clear that you weren't trying to solve journalism. I don't remember exactly how you phrased it. And I'm assuming that the reason you put that caveat there is because you don't want to claim that this is enough. This is sort of one piece of the puzzle and a lot more is needed. And you can elaborate on that if that's not correct. But I'm wondering if there is, if it can do maybe more than you're even suggesting. You know, we're talking about how everybody is so turned off by the news right now and how painful it is to listen to. And I'm wondering if you feel like maybe there is a desire by more mainstream audiences for this kind of news. When you think about things like, you know, that internet, what was it, some good news, stuff like that. The idea that maybe the public is kind of yearning for these sort of more local examples to solutions when we're just getting the same stories over and over and over again and people are sick of them.
Yeah, I definitely think that there is an appetite for this, and increasingly so. That's something that the Solutions Journalism Network's folks have also been looking into. You know, I guess like I put that phrasing there at the beginning because I think a lot of times when people write a book about journalism, the focus is on the journalism industry, but not on people and communities. And so I'm interested in thinking about how to help communities communicate with each other better, to, you know, like things that may or may not end up involving journalism with a capital J in the way we're traditionally used to seeing it. So sometimes people just want information. Sometimes people want things that are not necessarily a brilliant piece of investigative journalism. Sometimes I do want that too. But I think, I mean, I try to emphasize, you know, centering what the community wants and needs, and the assets that they have first, because I think we kind of tend to think about the industry and how to save it, and sometimes it is problematic. And so we don't necessarily want to preserve those things. So I think it's also about reimagining it. But I totally agree that at this moment there is definitely a hunger for both, you know, solutions journalism and engaged journalism more broadly, and that can address a lot of the sort of issues we have with disengagement or with news avoidance and things like that. Thank you. Patrick, I can't hear you.
Apologies, I put on mute. We probably time for one more question. I see Michelle Shaner has her hand up, so let's
If
go.
somebody else, because I already asked a question, does somebody else have a question?
Observe. Another hand up. Anyone want to jump in? Just unmute.
Christina had her hand up in the.
I wanted to turn to sort of the partnering with libraries, and sort of like, you know, there's, you know, libraries want to build relations. They have that longstanding trust factor. And so I'm curious if you have thoughts or ideas like for this current context, because, you know, oftentimes the way that the library helps to build relationships is through the public space. You know, you know, you bring people into the space and they have that kind of shared space. And now with libraries either having, you know, reduced hours or not everyone feeling comfortable coming in, do you have ideas or thoughts on how sort of like the library can help with that partnership?
It's a really excellent question. I actually, we organized a discussion about libraries in particular a couple months ago, and I can share that with you if it's useful, but I don't know that I know the answer to that exactly, because I feel like the situation's changing so much with so many libraries and what they are doing. I would like to hear more from the library side of it. I think that there's a number of projects right now. So I'm about to start working with, there's a project in Charlotte where they have Report for America fellows working in libraries that are connected also with the public radio station. And so I'm very curious to see how they're trying to use like library branches as sort of outreach posts to connect with people in those different communities and then connect them back to the public radio station. And yeah, I'm really interested to find out more about how they're adapting that. So unfortunately, I don't really have a specific answer, but I think that libraries just have so many resources apart from the space, and just, I think, just talking with them to brainstorm outreach strategies, because that's, their job is to think about how to provide information for their specific community. And so I think that they know a lot about what their community wants and needs, or at least how to find out. So I think that collaborating with libraries as resources is still something that can be done, even if they're not physically open. I'd love to think about that more.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and close this, but we're going to leave the Zoom site open so you can continue conversation amongst yourselves. And Professor Wenzel, if you're able to stick around, you may find other people want to ask you more questions, but your co-presenter may not want to, I'm not sure. Thank you very much. I will remind you that we have on October 2nd, we have a presentation for those of you that may be looking for ways to take your dissertation and develop into a book, or just for those of you looking to develop a book, called From Dissertation to Book, Strategies for Best Practices. And that will be on October 2nd from 10 to 11:15 a.m. I want to thank Professor Wenzel for sharing her excellent work with her. Really interesting, really important, really applied work. And thank you all for sharing, for coming.
Thank you. My co-presenter's fallen asleep, so I probably should go, but please feel free to reach out if you have questions, comments, or want to talk more. I'd love to hear from you.
Thanks again.